first one, called European Democracy Time to Reconquest. And I will give you the microphone to introduce the other speakers.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Please note that this is an interactive debate. You are encouraged to engage into the debate, ask any questions, or intervene when you feel it's necessary. Let me shortly introduce you the speakers, and afterwards I propose to continue the discussion in Romanian because translation into English and French is provided. So we have Mr. EKSTEIN KOVACS, lawyer, former politician and party member, perpetual activist for environmental issues and nominee for the Ombudsman institution in Romania. Please welcome Mr. Alexander Matkovic, who is coming from Serbia. He's researching economic issues. He's an activist and visiting scholar at the Humboldt University in Berlin.
For philosophy in Belgrade.
You are? Okay. And Mr. Andrei BULEARCA, who is here representing Funky Citizen, an NGO who builds research-based advocacy and educational programs and tools for young people and for citizens interested in understanding the democratic mechanisms. Okay, I'll start with the first question in Romania. Ca introducere, pentru că e o discuție la care nimeni nu are încă un răspuns definitiv.
Because in fact no one has a solution. What would you say has gone wrong with democracy in its current form?
Unii spun că
Some say that it's the economic problems, that the economy has known a slow growth, that there are disparities between social classes, that austerity measures during the crisis are the problems. So what do you think led to this crisis of democracy today? I don't really think democracy is in a crisis in Romania. I think in countries such as Poland and Hungary, the crisis is much deeper. I'm no longer in politics now. You even mentioned I was a lawyer, so I'm done with politics. But since 1990, for many years, I was part of politics, and I participated in the drawing up of the Constitution. And for a long time, I was a member of parliament. And I saw horrible things happen with the coal miners who were brought to Bucharest, with the coups that took place in Romania. But what I can see is progress and evolution of the democratic institutions in Romania and an evolution of democracy in general. I'm not trying to become the Romanian ombudsman, but I do realize that some essential institutions for democracy are in fact, some of them just superficial. But we took democracy seriously. We took to the streets, we protested, we voted, right? We did everything we had to do as citizens. But I realized that even the institutions need time to work properly. There are even relatively new institutions that are trying to learn the ropes. The ombudsman, however, in Romania doesn't really work really well as an institution. That's that. So I believe that democracy is a process. We can talk about the problems that democracy is currently facing, but I do believe in evolution, in progress. And I think that we're taking a good path. But do you feel an improvement or a deterioration in the way civil society works? You talked about the coal miners and their uprising. That was happening back in 1991. So, between 1991 and 2013, when the protests for Roșia Montană took place, how do you think Romania evolved from a civic point of view? I think it has evolved a lot. I'm glad you mentioned Roșia Montană, because that was a crucial moment. And that is because it involved many people who had just been observers up until then. And this sort of activism that came together around the mine exploitation in Roșia Montană. So this critical mass, let's call it that, has maintained its presence in the civic life of Romania. And I do believe it has evolved. And it has managed to attract new people. It has managed to reach out to many people. I don't know if it's nice to say this, but I think that the civic society has become more professional. Thank you very much, Alexander.
An addition about the evolution of democracy, deteriorating.
Is it work? Okay, so good evening everyone, and thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. So regarding the ombudsman, you mentioned that the ombudsman does not function here in Romania. Well, in Serbia, our ex-ombudsman Saša Janković was actually accused of having shot a man in his apartment. So, yeah, I mean, there are worse things. So we might be, relate to each other in that way also as well. But I also wanted to prove another point. Basically, I don't think you can have democratic institutions under austerity, unfortunately. I'm not saying that it's not viable, but it's not something that you can just decouple from the economic processes that we are basically living in. And regarding Serbia, it's basically on the whole planet, you actually had one country that had the longest transition into capitalism from communism. For Serbia, with 30 years. And for 30 years, my entire generation basically, witnesses back history, like a prehistory of austerity. Destroying social property, destroying privatizing enterprises, basically making the economy ready for the crisis that happened in 2008. And this is, I think, something that deeply changed our societies, and the effects of this we will continue to feel and will feel in the future. And regarding this, I just want to throw in also something that's not being discussed about currently, and that is that there is another crisis in the making. All over Europe and all over America, corporate debt is rising, basically. You have deflation coming in from China. You have lowering domestic demands. This is the consequence of what we have been doing for the last 30 years, of course. And doing democracy, I think that basically we're going to have a lot more problems with this. So it's not going to get better anytime soon, in my opinion. And also, I wanted to add that there is, regarding this issue, another problem. If you want to have democracy and if you want to have this sort of continual evolution, which I agree is necessary to happen, then you absolutely must have somebody pushing in the parliaments for a democratic power. And historically, in our post-communist societies, that was the task of the workers' movement, once as it existed. It is not in existence now in as much as it used to be, but that was the only thing I would dare to say that kept the democracy in the parliaments. For once you have ended all of this with the 1990s and the post-communist politics and party that came afterwards, there was no, there was no bulwark, there was no resistance to what is happening today. There was no resistance to austerity, no resistance to privatization, no resistance to all of these processes that have led us where we are basically now. And regarding also, I don't know if this would be in the discussion, I suppose it will, the European elections, you mentioned that. So I mean, this is for me a symptom of what's going on. We have these big elections, this big turnout, this big media, basically, a fanfare about this, which is important because it shows you where the things are going. But basically, it is not a coincidence that, you know, we have the loss of these great old parties like the SPD in Germany. The M25 didn't even make it in Germany that well. We have basically a polarization of the voting body. We have a polarization of these parties. But the fact is that this polarization, I don't think it will lead to anywhere, because you have another crisis in the coming, budgets are going to be contracted, there is going to be a lot more pressure on the parliament, what are you going to do with the money you have? And without, I would also dare say again, without a movement that would, you know, push the parliaments in this direction, I don't think like we would have any more democracy. So my basic point is that I completely agree that we should be supporting all of these parliamentary changes as well. But I think it cannot come from the parliaments alone. So, yeah.
Legat de ce spunea Alexandru, faptul că partidele sistemice și care au acces la parlamente și la decizie nu mai reflectă în mare parte nevoia din societate sau nevoile societății. În ce mod se poate face politică fără să ai acces la decizie? Mă refer la mișcările civice în
Talking
general,
about
sau la mișcările politice
civic
care
movements or political movements
succedat pe scena non-politică în ultimii ani.
Ok. Păi, în primul rând, din perspectiva mea,
first of all,
consider
from
că
my
e
perspective,
destul de important să
I
fie
think
o legătură
it's
destul de strânsă și
very
o
important
cale
for
de
there to be
comunicare deschisă între
an
societățile
open
civile și
dialogue
partidele
between
politice
civil
și
societies and political
politica în
parties
general,
and
pentru că,
generally
la urma urmei,
politics, because
societățile civile există să reprezinte oameni și să
civil
reprezinte
societies
la fel
are
ca
there
și
to
partidele
represent
politice. De
people,
altfel,
just
și
like political
consider că
parties.
această legătură,
And I think that this connection, this dialogue, should be quite strong. There should be an open communication between these two parties in order for us to progress and to evolve in a certain manner, so that we have a coherent path.
Nu știu, acum există cale dus întors, eu sunt pe calea întoarsă, adică după politică mai fac societate civilă.
Now that I have already been a politician, I moved to the civilian side of things. But there are many people coming from civil society who become politicians. For instance, my friend Mihai Goțiu, who started out as an activist, and he ended up a senator in Romania's parliament. Now, the relationship between civil society and parliament and politicians in general is quite murky. And here I would like to refer to some attempts to intimidate civil organizations. In Romania's parliament, there are several bills in this respect. Initially, they appeared to be personal initiatives of some members of parliament, but in time, they merged together. And I have a negative example here. I'm sorry to mention Hungary again in this sense. There, we have the campaign against Mr. Soros. The civilian organizations and the mass media are demonized, and this is a characteristic of an illiberal society. How would you define the concept of illiberal society? We can ask someone else coming from Hungary if you want. But what I notice is that the struggle for democracy is involves this idea of oppression, of repression, whether we talk about Salvini or Marine Le Pen or others, because they can find allies everywhere, even in Romania. The majority party in Romania, the Social Democrat Party, was prone to repression. But I think that civil society in Romania has become more active, and it's more active than in other countries. And I think that many politicians did not adhere to this illiberal project by the ruling party. And of course there are new political parties that have connections to civil society organizations, and I think that bodes well for the future. Why do you think the civil society doesn't work in Hungary? Nem tudom, I don't know, I don't understand. God knows, the phenomenon is too complex. I don't think it's the right time to delve into details right now.
I'd like to mention the record attendance at the European elections. What do you think about this? Yes, this was also due to the civil society. A lot of people also from the rural areas were mobilized to take part in these elections, and people who could feel that there was a stake in the European elections. Whether this was explicit or not, but there was still the idea of the European Union. What do we want to have? A federalization, a closer connection between member states. And then on the other hand, we had the Eurosceptics. And this is what mobilized people to go to vote. In my opinion, European elections were rather interesting. The last time we had European elections, I was still in high school. 2014, we had an attendance of 32%, and this time I did not expect such a high attendance. As a member of Funky Citizens, we were part of the whole procedure, observing as observers to the elections. This was my first such experience to observe the European elections, so I did not have a lot of expectations, but when I realized how attendance went up, I was really amazed. On the one hand, I was happy that people were going out to vote, but on the other hand, having this experience in the call center where people would call us with different issues, I was also saddened. I do have in general this tendency. I'm a rather optimistic person, as a young person. And I try to look at the bright side of things. However, as I was telling, there was something that saddened me, all the experiences that people lived through. Also the voting, how it was all organized abroad. Honestly, sitting there in the call center, I really said at one point, I cannot make it anymore. I will not take any call from abroad. Of course, I knew how I could help them, what they could say and what they could do. But there was something inside. It's something that keeps repeating, and I think this is something that we have to address, change, and improve. We have to improve the election process so that more people have access. We had the problems with the voting in Romanian embassies and consulates abroad, but whether there were also issues here in Romania. I heard of people staying in queues for hours on end and not being able to vote. There were also irregularities in counties such as Giurgiu. We received also calls from Cluj, people telling us that they are not allowed to vote. However, due to this experience and everything that we learned from one election to another, I think it is time to say it's time to wake up. We as civil society, and actually not only civil society, everyone has to wake up and do something to ensure access to voting. This is rather important. It might seem as a very common issue. Yes, there are two sides of the problem. First of all, developing more advanced tools to offer access to voting. I'd actually like to ask you, how do you think technology impacts on democracy? I'm thinking about Cambridge Analytica, about the United States, UK, big data influencing elections. On the one hand, technology could solve certain problems like universal voting rights.
I'm waiting for the translation, sorry.
But please do, Mr. Rickson.
These are two different issues. On the one side, we're talking about new technologies. New technologies do offer a broader access. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And on the other side, we have the perverse consequence of technology. Campaigns that we know about already. A way to counteract. I'm not very familiar with technology in general, but I think this is a challenge, an interesting challenge for the next period.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll answer in a bit crazy way. This question with technology has a lot to do. I mean, I know we touched upon a lot of issues here, so I'll try to summarize. But it has a lot to do actually with illiberal democracy, as you mentioned it. So you have Davos, for example, the business forum Davos, and like this hype about automation, the fourth industrial revolution. You have these businessmen who are basically sitting in there, dreaming about automation, it will get our economies out of the crash they are, so you have a lot of optimism about this thing with technologies and with the automation. And on the other side, well, you have, for example, the four of the biggest monopolies today: Google, Amazon, iPhones, Apple, Facebook, Tinder. I mean, these are monopolies. These are technological monopolies. Yeah, and Tinder actually is part of a network of applications which actually belong to the same company which structure human behavior. They're actually a company which is using all of these different applications, marketing them, on the principle that you can meet people, you can meet your partner, you can meet your whatever, you can meet, political, like-minded people. So there are apps for everything. And this is a consequence of the rise of the technological monopolies. And why is it a consequence of this? It is because somewhere in Silicon Valley in the USA, you have people who are basically living very wealthy lives, sucking in half of the government money, outsourcing their jobs to China. Our chips, our computer and our cell phones are produced by outsourcing of production. 80% of neoliberal foreign trade actually goes by outsourcing of production. So how did these monopolies grow? They grew by saving wages, by saving the workforce, by using the Chinese workforce, Bangladeshi workforce, by using the peripheral countries. The same process is also something that has to do with our automobiles, for example. Fiat cars, they were produced in Serbia, in my country, and they were produced in the most gruesome ways imaginable. We had actually a hospital next to a Fiat factory where young people ages 18 to 25 would just be relegated to the hospital should they collapse on the assembly line. And the only time we actually heard about this was when they started scratching cars. They scratched the cars because nobody would like to hear them. So this is how our cars are produced, and this is how our cell phones are produced. This is how every object we have in this room is produced. So it is not a coincidence that we have all these technological monopolies, but I don't think it will lead to anywhere good because, as you mentioned, Cambridge Analytica, big data, influencing elections. I mean, we have all of these new possibilities to influence elections in good or bad ways. It is up to the monopolies. And as long as they are not democratically controlled, aka in private ownership, we will not have the ability to control upon our own lives in this matter. So for me, it is something a bit dangerous because I go against this optimism of Davos and the businessmen who actually see in this some sort of a solution to the crisis. And this actually has something to do with what I mentioned before, and that there's another crisis coming, and I don't see Google, Facebook, Amazon, and these kind of people helping us. They will not do so. They have not helped us before, and they will not do so because they accumulate money, and they are not there to help us. So this is one thing, and just to end shortly, illiberal democracy. It has everything to do with economy, everything to do with the crisis. And when we say liberal democracy, to me it sounds like saying, an euphemism, it's a liberal democracy. Yes, it's a liberal democracy, but we also had something called fascism, and it was also a different form of capitalism from the one we are used to. The idea that capitalism is something you live in, you receive your wage, you receive your pension, you receive, your social security. I mean, when was the last time somebody of us actually had free public education? 20 years ago, at least in Serbia. And when was the last time we had free healthcare? I don't have free healthcare. I don't have free education. I don't have all this stuff because this sort of system is built upon destroying these kind of things. And just to end with this, why this is not only liberal democracy, it's illiberal capitalism, and it's something we experienced also in the 1930s. Let me just repeat to you the news from Serbia, just in the last 2 days. We had a new proposal from a right-wing organization to make citizenship patrols to help the police. Citizenship patrols on the street. Patrols on the street. Yeah, to help the police. Yeah. There's also one friend of mine in Serbia who can also help me with this if I omit something. But we also had, for example, today the news is that the pension is no longer, it's not logical anymore because the age by which you will go to receive your pension is 75. And the age when you die in Serbia is 75. So we will not have any pensions. It's that high. It reached that sort of level. Also, we're number one by inequality in Europe, by the gap between the rich and the poor. We also we're the first in brain drain. People are leaving Serbia. Entire generations are leaving. Half of my friends are not in Serbia. I was living in Berlin once, and half my friends are living in Berlin. So that's where Serbia is going now, to Germany, basically, to be outsourced as cheap labor force again. So this is what is going on. We also have something called, and I think you will tomorrow have a presentation upon this, we also have something called the Waterfront in Belgrade. It was a project by the government to introduce a Dubai-style luxury hotels because of which they destroyed an entire neighborhood, killed a few people, expelled immigrants just so that they could build some sort of hotel. This is what's going on basically usually, and also last month the wage you receive is less than what you have to pay for your bills. So our entire economy is just going berserk. It's crazy. And we're one of the most exploited economies now in Europe. So this is a model for what I think are things to come, and not something that just happens like that, because it relates to the way the companies, the multinationals, the Facebook, Google, Amazon, Fiat, Mercedes, BMW, all of these companies that you and I know of are accumulating their profits based upon the outsourcing of production on the periphery, the exploitation of the workers, and by funding and financing governments like Serbia's. So for me, these are related issues, and I know it's complicated. It's not easy, it's never been easy, but this is something that I think we need to know, and this is something that I think we need to connect, because when we focus on elections, when we focus on democracy, it is just the tip of the iceberg. You have so much processes below it, and you need to know who your enemies are. And your enemies have their names, and they're Mercedes, BMW, Facebook, Google, Amazon. So just to think about it.
Thank you. Vă rog să-l accesați pe Alexander dacă doriți să continuăm.
Yes, please approach Alexander if you would like to carry on this topic of economic nazification. I'd like to now ask Andrei about the 80s project that they are running with Funky Citizens. This is a very important topic. Why? It makes young people from a very young age responsible. And it also makes them think about what truth means. Yes, this is a more optimistic approach than until now. 80s is a project that is being funded within a program that is supported by the US Embassy in Romania. The aim of the project is to talk to people, to young people, especially to high school pupils, to talk to them about democracy and rights. Maybe this topic doesn't sound so interesting to them, so we came up with a new perspective. Let's try about these rights in contrast with our communist past, with the 80s. It's very hard to generalize what communism meant, and we did not want to do this either. We actually wanted to talk in depth about civic education. So we recreated in Bucharest a typical flat of the 80s, a typical communist flat. Typical. What does this mean? You may imagine pupils coming there. It can't be really a typical apartment. People wouldn't fit in. Not even 10 persons would fit in such an apartment. We are often criticized that the space is too large to be representative, actually, for a communist flat from the 80s. But we did not want to have a representative space. We did not want to have a gallery. We wanted to have a context where we could educate high school pupils. They first receive 5 questions so that we can create a context, especially if they did not talk about communism with relatives. So these are 5 questions that they receive, and they have to ask these questions to people they know, to people that lived through communism. For example, what was your favorite food? How difficult was it to get access to it? What were 3 disadvantages of communism and living in communism? What is the most impactful memory We talked about impact because we did not want to differentiate between good or bad memories. And another question, what did people do in their leisure time, their spare time? Then the students come to them, we split them up in groups in 4 rooms. We have 4 rooms there, the kitchen, the pupils' room and so on. And what they first have to do is to interact with the space itself, just to get a grasp of what living under communism meant. One of the more interesting tasks, in my opinion, is the following. They have to watch 1 minute of the Nicolae Ceausescu's speech from the 17th of December 1989, when the revolution in Timișoara broke out. They hear Ceausescu talking about protesters as if they were hooligans, as fascists, imperialists, and several other such attributes. And then they have to listen to 1 minute from Radio Free Europe. Radio Free Europe told completely different stories. It reported that protesters went on the streets to ask for their rights to be acknowledged. So they received 2 pieces of information relating to the same event, to this very same event, but the pieces of information themselves are very contradictory. Then they have to write a letter to a friend from the Federal Republic of Germany to ask in a more nuanced, hidden way what the truth is. And as you can realize, there are a lot of subtleties involved in this task. They learn about censorship, about the fact that what the Securitate was doing, that letters would be read, and so on. And they also have to take several moral decisions, and at the end, maybe the most important part is a round of discussion. We talk to them and ask them, what do you think? How was it for you to spend 2.5 hours and try to relive such an experience? How did you feel having your rights not acknowledged? How would you feel now if in present days unknown people would read your posts or private messages on Facebook or WhatsApp and so on? And this is how we reach several interesting conclusions. They start realizing why it is so important to defend the rights that they do have in a democracy. Why is it so important to be an active member of everyday life, of society? Why is it so important to know your representatives, to inform yourself before making a decision? And we try to guide them to different platforms for civic education. We also rewrote the constitution. It's actually it's not rewritten. It's the Romanian constitution, but in a simpler language with illustrations. I think I also have such a brochure with me now. So we try to raise awareness and make them be more involved. How many beneficiaries do you have within the project? Up until now, about 350 young people who visited the 80s apartment. We hope to have even more participants. At the moment, this project will be continued until October. If you happen to come to Bucharest and want to relive some experiences, I invite you, not only high school pupils visited the flat. There are people coming there and saying, oh, I had that at home as well. This is something that you usually hear. Yes, I also had something like this. So, this is the project, 80s. I think such initiatives manage to internalize this exercise of democracy, of practice of democracy. What saved the European elections that took place 1 month ago were the cities, actually, the city dwellers who went to vote. How can we export this democratic exercise to the countryside? Well, in rural areas, in fact, are mostly more dominated by politics. So in villages, the mayor is an important voice, the priest, and maybe the teacher. So it's more difficult to bring new ideas against such influences, if you'll allow me. Nevertheless, even in villages, I can see this category of people who live off agriculture, mainly agriculture, although most people nowadays are called farmers, not peasants. And they have a strong position in their community because they are successful people. So these people, in my opinion, could be asked by democratic political parties to join. And I think they could bring a breath of fresh air in villages. We keep saying that Moldova keeps voting for the Democratic Socialist Party in Romania. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's the same in any village. Villages are in fact not that easily influenced. Thank you very much. Are there any comments in the room or any questions to our guests? Please. My name is Laurent. Now, about when and how we're listened to. Yes, I agree with criticism about what happened before 1999, but we shouldn't stop there. So we all use Facebook, we have microphones on our phones, in our pockets basically. If we believe we're not being listened to, well, we're wrong. And that is dangerous as well, to think that way. And about how we can I'm quite sensitive to how we keep saying that some people do not represent their own interest. Many people, most people in my opinion, do represent their own interest. Of course, their opinions might be different from ours, but it doesn't mean that we hold the truth. Anyway, I think there are many hues and shades that we can talk about. It was more of a comment than a question, but you can reply if you want.
Just like I agree with you completely. When you say it, we're not being listened to now. I propose to you make an experiment. repeat any name to your mobile phone for one day, you will see a product on Facebook the other day, tomorrow. Because what Facebook and Google actually have are algorithms that are installed on your phone that they can recognize several concepts, like shoes, t-shirt, and then they suggest to you, what to buy. So yes, maybe Ceausescu is not listening to you, but Mark Zuckerberg is. So, it's not that much of a difference, And also Facebook, for example, has ties with the NATO and, so it also has ties with all the European police from each nation state. So it's not, I completely agree with you, it's not that we're not being listened to, it's just that we don't know. So and there's also a very big difference to that. And also when I think, when we mentioned communism, yes, of course, communism is not only Ceausescu, and I have no intention to defend him whatsoever, and I think it should be criticized, but communism is also not Ceausescu. I mean, like, I come from a Yugoslav country, so, which was a bit liberal and was a bit different, so what I would reply to, when somebody wants to criticize communism, I would say yes, but criticize it from communist lines, because it was not something that I would equate completely as like historical communism with communism as such. And the difference is that while you are now being listened to, by Facebook and not by Ceausescu, at least then you had a flat. I don't have a flat now. I'm listened to, but still, if there's a difference between what I would have in Yugoslavia, I would at least have a flat. So, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to reply in English because I think that's going to be easier.
Thanks.
But towards just empowering the idea about criticizing communism, I want to make it sort of clear that what we're doing is not trying to criticize communism through any means, way, shape, or form when it comes to our project. At the end of the day, our goal is to just try and present as objectively as possible, although it's quite obvious we're people, we're subjective, and just how you take the information, it's going to be subjective either way. But we're trying to just present some facts that used to happen and some things that used to be. But this is just, let's say, sort of an excuse to talk a bit more about democracy and make it more interesting while having them learn a bit about their recent history, considering in high schools in Romania, we're not really taught that much about what exactly communism is. Like, I can tell you from experience, we study constitutions, but not just communist constitutions. We study the constitutions, and then we study a bit about Nicolae Ceausescu and Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dej, but the thing is, that's usually the last part of the school curriculum we go through, and it's right before one of the biggest exams that we have to take when we finish high school, and I think it's a situation that's a bit overlooked. At the same time, we're not trying to generalize on communism by, again, any means. That's why the name is atheist. That's why we're basically trying to talk more about the atheists, because it's hard and it's wrong to generalize communism that manifested in so many different ways in so many different countries, and that maybe had some advantages. I mean, like, for sure had some advantages from some perspectives, but it's just easier to create this opportunity to talk when it comes to the 80s in Romania, more specifically after 1982, after the rationing started, after we had all that immense debt and that had to be paid off in some way. So, yeah.
Might I, sorry. Okay, just like a short few sentences. Yeah, of course, that's why it would be very difficult to focus on repression like in the 50s, because you had the modernization then, and also like what was the alternative? You had, I think, the Iron Guard, as far as I remember. So, yeah, it's also something that we don't necessarily have in mind, but we are basically taught, and I think this is also some Stalinist heritage, if I may address that. So I don't love Ceausescu. I mean, so just to make that clear. It should be criticized, but I think the ways in which we are taught to criticize these regimes that basically made us, their heritage, is by way of viewing communism as something that is a personal thing of Tito, Ceausescu, whatever. That there was socialism in one country. There was never socialism in one country. It cannot function in one country. And why I say this, I mean, my PhD also, like the stuff I research, I do research on the political economy of fascism and how fascism functions economically. And what's interesting is that the first impulse also came from the monopolies, also came from the same names I mentioned, like BMW, Audi. These guys are still living. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that there was a failure of the revolution in Germany. And something that we forget, that communism was never supposed to be a thing of one state. It was supposed to be a world revolution. Sometimes, way back in the past, in history, people actually thought that this was a reality. And we are basically criticizing from perspectives of our own country, which I think also forgets that the same process destroyed the initial communist movements, and there were like by the thousands across Europe. It also destroyed communist countries later on. In Yugoslavia, we had the IMF come and dictate to us like what should we do with the economy. You also had the Truman Doctrine by the USA, you know, anti-socialist politics. You had very, on the other side of the debates, once you go out, it's a very interesting historical moment, the 80s. You have Margaret Thatcher, you have Ronald Reagan, you have neoliberalism, the reality which we are living in today being constructed at that moment, being constructed by the European market, being constructed by deconstructed communist regimes in Europe. That's very interesting. And if I may end with one quote, it was actually from a director of the IMF who wrote a book called The Silent Revolution. His name is Michel Cavedessus. You might not remember it, but the book is called The Silent Revolution, where he basically says, yes, the IMF was making its own silent revolution on the socialist Balkans in the 80s and outlining all the politics they did do against socialism. So I'm not saying that every person who lived in communist countries is good. I don't think that. And I think it should be criticized, but the other side should be criticized as well, and that are basically, as I said, the idea that you do have some enemies, and the idea that they have names. And those names are also IMF and the World Bank, and the institutions such as this. So there's no black and white situation, and I think that these guys are actually very intentionally, fucked up us and our economies, and we should, make them pay for that sometimes in the future.
Am un scurt comentariu legat de intervenția ta și probabil că
I have a short comment related to what you were saying. I think I wasn't making myself too clear when I was saying that there is no true democracy in rural areas. I didn't mean that people voted wrongly or against their own interests. I'm aware of the fact that center-right political parties do not address rural issues, but it was something along the lines of what Mr. EKSTEIN was saying, that people are too influenced in rural areas to cast their vote one way or another.
So I would like to come back a little bit.
He was the first.
No, I was the first, sorry. He was the second. It's okay. No, because I would like to reflect on this short debate, and I'm sorry, but it seemed to me a little bit authoritarian to say that communism can be criticized only by the communist lines. So
it was a half joke, but
okay.
Yes, so it is authoritarian.
Thank you. Okay, and then I think anthropology, cultural, social anthropology can help us a little bit in choosing the right terms, because in anthropology they call these regimes real socialisms, and they never speak in a certain literature about communist regimes. So I think we have to make a clear-cut difference in between communist ideology, okay, and the historically, I don't know, processed political regimes in the past, in the 20th century. I think that we can maybe put in more different ways the problem that, I think if we think of those regimes as one-party systems, that's a problem. So a one-party system is not compatible, in my mind, with democracy. Probably we can agree that the way they applied communist or, I don't know, socialist ideologies, it was kind of problematic. Okay. And then I think, to go back, I think the initiative of Andrei and the guys he works with is really useful because, maybe these regimes before '89 worked in a much more primitive way, if you want. But it's from a didactical point of view, it's maybe easier to show how such regimes work. It's a very nice lesson for all of us. It's very easy to show how censorship and manipulation, whatever, worked, and we don't have to forget that all what you are criticizing after '90, the I don't know, so-called privatizations and whatever, have to deal with what happened before '89.
Shall we reply now or to make a, because there was another question?
No,
okay.
Much more a comment.
Oui, je vais parler en français. Et c'était pour dire en fait sur la démocratie, j'ai l'impression en fait que dans notre société, si on explique à des gens que, par exemple, democracy,
when we explain to our societies that when they eat Nutella, this impacts on the forest, this has a negative impact on their health, that this is a consequence of big company lobby, they will say, people will just say that they like Nutella. And I actually read about Nutella. No, I read somewhere that Nutella is produced in factories where workers are actually can benefit from this, because if they were to work somewhere else, they would work in very toxic environments. So does this discourse have any impact on us, or does it merely trigger emotional reactions? Such pieces of information tell us that we act like someone who is alcoholized. With someone who is alcoholic, who has withdrawal symptoms.
I completely agree. We are sometimes like we're alcoholized. And there's a nice quote from Nietzsche when he says that Europe is alcoholized as a continent. He hated beer. So to repeat maybe this, there is no political organizing, in my view, without economic organizing. And if we don't, have this idea, then we're acting as alcoholized. So this is, for me, very important, because you can only do so much as an activist. You can do protests, you can do elections, but beyond that, you need to have a great organization, and this is something we are lacking. And this is why we are living in these times, because there's not enough resistance. So to underline that it has to be also economic resistance. And this brings me to your point, and thank you for the comments. I agree, I think that they're really insightful. And I wanted also to bring that point into discussion. There's no equation between communism as some abstract wish, we want to live in communism, and what actually existed. So that is, for a start, those were really historically existing socialisms. But when you criticize them, and I would actually repeat this point basically, but in another way, you have museums of communism all over Europe. You have in Hungary the Museum of Terror, which the name sells it all. In Berlin, you also have the history of the GDR Museum in Berlin, where you can play a game. It's like a video game that you can play, but actually you only have one option to lose the game. So you can, like, there's a game about planned economy, you can, tweak it a little bit, build a power plant, play it, but each time you play it, you lose. So my point would be, okay, that can be there, but unless there's also another option that you can win, that's also always a biased game, unless you leave people the opportunity to actually, see these good sides, there's no point in criticizing it if you want to just prove badly what happened. But okay, this is just a very basic point. Another point that is, I think, more concrete is when you speak about communisms, speak about historically existing communisms, I always like to compare that to contemporary times, because we lost, at least from the post-socialist perspectives, we lost what we had from that times. And I think that this is something that divides different countries, because countries which did not have this historical experience of living in these regimes are sometimes more easily prone to equate this with censorship and these aspects. But I do think Romania actually is an extreme example. So, I think that Ceausescu would never
what have you lost?
What?
What did you lose?
Oh, I can enumerate a lot of things: jobs, apartments, free healthcare, education, stuff like that. What we lost from that, I just everything what we lost from there, like free education, healthcare, social systems.
What did you say exactly before?
That from our perspective, from the post-socialist countries, we lost some things. So that's also one place, but I wouldn't say that democracy is not necessarily incompatible with one-party system, although I would never mention, because, yes, there is a very interesting argument by Edward Cardell. He's one of the architects of self-management. When they ask him that, and he basically, his answer to this, by the way, I don't agree that one-party system should be, but it's a very interesting argument, that what is a party system at all? What is parties in general? They are divisions of, votes from the people in the parliament, which historically was actually, when we speak about democracy and a multi-party system, the idea that workers would vote is new. The idea that women would vote is new. Both were actually won. They were not given, these rights were not given. The idea that I, as a worker, would vote, or that somebody who is a woman would vote, were actually successful battles. The original English parliament never had these things, but had a multi-party system that have, you have the Whigs, you have the aristocrats, so they could vote between themselves. That's okay. Multi-party system. Democracy, no. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that in Yugoslavia, at least, it's just an example, we had one-party system, but this was made out of delegations, which were democratically chosen to an extent, then it degenerated, but yes, there was more democracy then than before. In the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, we had multi-party systems that were basically a party system between...
And then there was more democracy than in the Middle Ages.
Yes, but it was also a successful battle of the... but it was a successful of the workers' movement, so we should not forget that. Anyway, I don't believe there could be one-party system, but I just want to throw that in the discussion. If you ask me what would be the best system, it would be a delegate system from different communes from below. So something that I see happening in Europe a little bit today. I'm not optimistic, but at least I see it being happening again, that we have these mass mobilizations across Europe, and I think that they have an inherently democratic element to that, which if I would like to place my bet, I would say that have a minimal chance, but a chance to go beyond what both communism and liberalisms have been historically so far given to us. So I think it remains a task to be achieved, basically. Yeah.
Mai avem timp pentru o întrebare, dacă doriți să...
Je vais parler en français.
I will speak in French.
Donc, in translation. Okay. Vous avez utilisé cette partie de la table, pas vous, des mots valises.
On this side of the round table, I've noticed the use of some strong words that refer to complex realities. You talked about the relationship between democracy and civil society, and you said that this was just a contextual connection. The Weimar Republic did not hamper the rise of Nazism. Back then there was a warmth of civil society as well. And then you talked about the connection between democracy and liberalism. Liberalism got along very well with the racist theories. They always got along well. So from my point of view, you mismatched some things that could lead to larger problems. If we were to dig deeper, where do all these problems come from? You equated Roșia Montană and civil society, so the movement, the protest for Roșia Montană and civil society. But the great conflict does not lie there. I think that Roșia Montană is an issue that has to be dealt with state surveillance-wise and state involvement-wise.
Même si les gens y croient, même si ça peut donner de bons résultats, on a une société civile qui est programmée de manière exogène. Et là, je vais revenir un peu à ce que vous disiez sur la révolution néolibérale. C'est plutôt du côté américain qu'il faudrait aller voir.
As for the neoliberal revolution, this has to be analyzed especially from an American point of view, and of the 1980s. That's when the direction changed. We started talking about human rights, and we talked about them in Trotsky's terms. Stalinists transformed, simply transformed.
L'anticommunisme se développe véritablement à partir des années 80. Avant ça, il n'est pas si fort que ça. Il est organisé par des anciens communistes qui ont une idée autoritaire de la politique.
Before, there was no real anti-communist force. It developed only after the 1980s. And the criticism to democracy is going down. Democracy within the EU is a construct of liberalism. It is an attempt to confine people's freedoms. Basically, what we are told is the fact that people are idiots, and that's what the idea that arose today as well, that people are not stupid. We can interpret the realities we're talking about whichever way we want. It's very difficult to really criticize today's democracy. The democracy that we see today is not a real, a true democracy. It has become a slogan, a mere slogan. And beyond the slogan, we can see stronger and stronger effects. And these effects lead liberalism upwards. Thatcher's politics led to neoliberalism. Oh, I think I was talking too fast. I'm sorry. I'm done now. Shall I go back and say my whole argument again? I think only the French people could follow your argument.
Ça faisait rien notre collègue de Serbie, donc je pense qu'ils ont réussi à suivre.
I think that my colleague from Serbia managed to follow my argument.
The translator was also it. So, yeah, maybe we could speak slowly more so the people could translate. Yeah?
We can continue the discussion after.
Da, trebuie să încheiem și vă rugăm să continuați discuția în pauză după ce se termină. Ok, mulțumim mult de prezență.
We can continue the conversation during the break.
We can continue the discussion with the drinks and the bar is open and we can have a chat. Thank you very much.